Avoidants are loyal to one thing only, and it's not you. That sentence sounds cruel the first time you hear it, especially if you spent months, maybe years, trying to become the exception. You gave patience where most people would have walked away. You gave understanding when their silence made no sense. You excused the distance, the mixed signals, the emotional disappearing acts, because every once in a while they would come back just close enough to make you believe there was something real underneath it all. And there was something real. That's the part nobody tells you. Avoidants can absolutely feel love, deeply, intensely even. But love is not the thing running their life. Love is not the thing they protect most. Their deepest loyalty is to emotional self-preservation, to control, to safety, to never again feeling trapped, exposed, overwhelmed, dependent, or emotionally powerless. And the moment a relationship threatens that internal safety system, something shifts inside them almost automatically. The walls go up, the warmth cools, the distance begins. Not because you suddenly became unlovable, but because closeness itself started feeling dangerous. And if you've ever sat there staring at your phone wondering how somebody could be so affectionate one week and emotionally unreachable the next, this video is probably going to hit harder than you expect. So before we go deeper into the psychology behind this, take 2 seconds to subscribe. Seriously, if you've ever felt emotionally confused by someone who acted like they wanted love and feared it at the exact same time, this channel is basically group therapy without the awkward chairs and bad coffee. The hardest thing to understand about avoidance is that most of them do not consciously wake up thinking, "I'm going to hurt someone today." In fact, many of them genuinely believe they are trying their best. But underneath their behavior is an invisible contract they made with themselves a long time ago, usually before they even had the words to explain it. The contract sounds something like this: never need too much, never depend too much, never trust closeness completely, and never let another person have enough emotional power to destroy you. That contract becomes their emotional operating system. It follows them into every relationship, every connection, every vulnerable moment. And because it operates beneath the surface, they often don't even realize it's controlling them. They may tell you they want commitment. They may talk about the future. They may genuinely enjoy your presence. But the second emotional intimacy starts demanding consistency, accountability, vulnerability, or emotional dependence, their nervous system quietly starts sounding an internal alarm. Suddenly, what once felt comforting begins to feel suffocating. What once felt exciting begins to feel emotionally risky, and this is where so many people get trapped in confusion, because the avoidance behavior changes right when the relationship becomes real. At first they leaned in, now they lean away. At first they opened up, now every conversation feels shallow or distant. At first they reassured you, now you feel like you're begging for basic emotional connection. The shift feels personal, but for avoidance it's often psychological survival mode activating in real time. What makes this even more painful is that avoidants often appear incredibly secure in the beginning, calm, independent, mature, emotionally stable. They don't come across as needy, clingy, or chaotic, which can feel refreshing if you've dealt with emotionally volatile people in the past. But that early stage version of them exists because the relationship still feels emotionally manageable. There's enough distance for them to feel safe, enough uncertainty for them to maintain control, enough freedom to avoid feeling fully emotionally responsible for another person's inner world. In those early moments, intimacy feels optional, not consuming, but slowly, without either person fully realizing it, emotional attachment deepens. The texts start meaning more. The silence starts carrying weight, expectations form naturally, vulnerability increases, and this is where the avoidance internal conflict begins, because while most people experience deeper emotional connection as comforting, avoidants often experience it as pressure, not always consciously, not always logically, but physically and emotionally. Their system starts interpreting closeness as danger. That's why they can seem so contradictory. They may miss you deeply while actively distancing themselves from you. They may crave connection while resisting the very behaviors that create it. They may love you and still emotionally retreat from you at the exact same time. And if you don't understand this dynamic, you'll spend endless nights trying to decode behavior that was never really about you to begin with. The truth is, avoidants are not primarily loyal to relationships. They are loyal to maintaining emotional equilibrium inside themselves. Their independence is not just a preference, it's protection. Somewhere in their past, needing people became associated with disappointment, criticism, emotional overwhelm, rejection, inconsistency, or loss of control. So they adapted. They learned to rely on themselves emotionally because relying on others felt unsafe. And over time, that self-reliance became sacred. That's why they guard their freedom so intensely. That's why emotional demands feel threatening even when they come from someone loving them sincerely. To another person, closeness might mean security. To an avoidant, too much closeness can feel like losing oxygen. It can feel like their inner world is being invaded, like expectations are closing in around them, like they're slowly becoming emotionally trapped. And the tragedy is that the more emotionally invested you become, the more their instinct to protect themselves often increases. So while you're trying to move closer, they instinctively start creating space, sometimes subtly, sometimes suddenly. They take longer to reply. They become emotionally vague. They immerse themselves in work, hobbies, routines, distractions. They intellectualize emotions instead of feeling them. They say they just need space even when nothing dramatic happened. And to the person on the receiving end, it feels devastating because it creates a relationship where intimacy is constantly almost there but never fully safe enough to stay. And this is the part people struggle to accept. You cannot compete with someone's survival programming. No amount of loyalty, patience, reassurance, understanding, attractiveness, or sacrifice can heal a wound that somebody is still committed to protecting. Because avoidants are not just avoiding other people, they are avoiding the emotional exposure that comes with truly being seen. Real intimacy requires surrender. It requires letting another person matter enough that they can hurt you. It requires emotional dependence to some degree. And for someone whose nervous system equates dependence with danger, that feels terrifying beneath the surface. So they stay loyal to the one thing that has always made them feel safe: emotional control. Control over how much they reveal. Control over how attached they become. Control over how vulnerable they allow themselves to feel. Control over when they pull close and when they disappear. And if you've ever loved someone like this, you know how emotionally exhausting it becomes trying to earn consistency from someone who is fighting an invisible battle inside themselves every single day. Because eventually you realize something heartbreaking. They are not choosing distance because you lacked value. They are choosing distance because closeness threatens the emotional system they built their entire identity around surviving with. And this is why so many avoidants live inside a contradiction that even they struggle to explain. On one side, there is a very real hunger for love, connection, companionship, and emotional closeness. But on the other side, there is an equally powerful fear of what love eventually asks from them. Because love, real love, slowly removes the emotional exits. It asks for consistency on difficult days, not just easy ones. It asks for honesty when emotions get messy. It asks for emotional presence even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. And for someone who spent years surviving by emotionally detaching, those requirements can feel less like romance and more like surrender. That's why avoidants often don't fear love itself. They fear the loss of control that love creates inside them. They fear becoming emotionally dependent on another human being. They fear needing reassurance. They fear disappointing someone who genuinely cares about them. They fear being consumed by expectations they don't know how to meet. And most of all, they fear the possibility that if they fully let someone in, they could eventually be abandoned, rejected, criticized, controlled, or emotionally overwhelmed all over again. So instead of risking that level of emotional exposure, they unconsciously try to manage intimacy in controlled doses. Just enough closeness to feel connection, just enough distance to still feel safe. But relationships cannot survive forever in emotional half measures. Eventually, somebody starts craving deeper consistency. Eventually, somebody notices the emotional walls. Eventually, somebody feels lonely standing beside a person who physically exists there but emotionally remains guarded behind invisible glass. What makes this dynamic even more confusing is that avoidants often look calm on the outside while their nervous system is silently panicking underneath. People assume avoidance is calculated coldness, but many times it's actually emotional overload disguised as detachment. Their body interprets emotional intensity almost like a threat response. Closeness activates stress instead of comfort. Vulnerability activates anxiety instead of relief. So when conflict happens, when emotions deepen, when attachment becomes undeniable, their nervous system immediately starts searching for escape routes. Sometimes they withdraw physically, sometimes emotionally. Sometimes they suddenly become too busy. Sometimes they hyper-focus on flaws in the relationship that never seemed important before. Sometimes they convince themselves they've lost feelings when in reality they've simply become emotionally overwhelmed. And because avoidants are often disconnected from their own emotional processing, they may not even recognize what is happening internally. All they know is that something feels heavy, pressured, or emotionally consuming, and distance suddenly feels like relief. That relief becomes addictive. Space calms their nervous system. Solitude restores their sense of control. Emotional disengagement temporarily removes the pressure they associate with closeness. And this is why they can pull away from people they genuinely care about without fully understanding why they're doing it. To the outside world, it looks irrational. To their nervous system, it feels necessary for survival. This is also why logic becomes one of the avoidant's greatest emotional weapons. Instead of sitting inside difficult feelings, they often analyze them from a distance. They intellectualize emotions instead of emotionally experiencing them. They explain rather than reveal. They rationalize rather than surrender. If vulnerability starts rising, they retreat into thinking mode because thinking feels safer than feeling. You'll notice how quickly avoidance can shift emotional conversations into practical conversations. They focus on schedules, responsibilities, work, plans, surface-level topics, anything that allows them to stay mentally engaged without becoming emotionally exposed. And over time, this creates a painful imbalance in relationships. One person is trying to emotionally connect while the avoidant is trying to emotionally regulate. One person is asking, "Can we get closer?" while the avoidant's nervous system is quietly asking, "How do I keep from losing myself?" And this is where so many partners accidentally exhaust themselves trying to decode the avoidance behavior. They assume inconsistency means lack of care. They assume withdrawal means lack of love. They assume distance means somebody else must be involved. But often the avoidant is simply trapped in an internal war between attachment and self-protection. A war where emotional closeness feels both deeply desired and deeply unsafe at the exact same time. And maybe the most heartbreaking part is that avoidance can absolutely recognize your value while still being unable to sustain emotional intimacy with you. That's the part that destroys people emotionally because it removes the comforting narrative that if I were more lovable, this would have worked. Sometimes the avoidant knows you are supportive, patient, emotionally intelligent, loyal, and genuine. Sometimes they know you are exactly the kind of person they should feel safe with. But trauma responses do not operate according to logic. Survival patterns do not disappear just because somebody good enters your life. In fact, emotionally healthy love can sometimes feel even more threatening to avoidance because healthy love removes the emotional chaos they're accustomed to hiding behind. There are no distractions left, no games left, no emotional confusion left to focus on, just intimacy, just consistency. Just someone truly seeing them. And for a person who learned long ago that emotional exposure leads to pain, being deeply seen can feel terrifying. So they retreat toward the one thing that has always felt predictable: emotional control. They become loyal to managing their inner discomfort above all else. Above connection, above vulnerability, sometimes even above the person they genuinely love. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of this, you know how deeply destabilizing it feels. Because loving an avoidant often creates a relationship where you are constantly trying to earn emotional safety that keeps moving further away the closer you get to it. You start monitoring their moods, their tone changes, their texting patterns, their emotional availability. You become hyper-aware of every slight shift because deep down you're trying to prevent the next withdrawal before it happens. You begin shrinking your own needs so they won't feel pressured. You become understanding to the point of self-abandonment. You tell yourself not to ask for reassurance because you don't want to push them away. You carry the emotional weight of the relationship quietly, hoping that if you just love them correctly enough, they'll finally stop running. But this is where people lose themselves. Because the more you emotionally chase someone who fears closeness, the more the relationship becomes organized around avoiding their discomfort instead of honoring your own emotional needs. And eventually you realize something painful. You have been fighting for emotional connection with someone who is still fighting against emotional vulnerability itself. Not against you specifically, against the feeling of needing anyone at all. And until that person consciously chooses to confront the fear underneath their avoidance, every relationship will eventually collide with the exact same invisible wall, no matter how real the love may have been in the beginning. Most avoidants were not born emotionally distant. That's the detail people forget when they reduce avoidance to simple selfishness. Somewhere earlier in life, usually long before adult relationships ever entered the picture, emotional closeness stopped feeling safe. Maybe emotions were ignored. Maybe vulnerability was met with criticism, punishment, unpredictability, or emotional abandonment. Maybe they learned that expressing needs created disappointment instead of comfort. Maybe they were forced to grow up too quickly and became emotionally self-sufficient before they were ready. Whatever the exact story was, the lesson settled deep into the nervous system. Relying on people hurts, needing people weakens you, and emotional survival depends on staying in control of yourself at all times. So they adapted in the only way they knew how. They learn to detach from overwhelming emotions. They learn to suppress needs before those needs could be rejected. They learn to avoid vulnerability before vulnerability could become humiliation. And over time, that adaptation stopped feeling like a defense mechanism and started feeling like their personality. That's why many avoidants genuinely believe they are simply independent, when underneath that independence is often a lifelong fear of emotional dependency itself. They built an identity around not needing too much from anyone because deep down, needing people once felt emotionally dangerous. And this is where relationships with avoidants become incredibly confusing because their version of loyalty often looks very different from emotional availability. Many avoidants can stay physically present for years. They can provide stability in practical ways. They can show up consistently in routines, responsibilities, acts of service, even commitment labels. But emotional intimacy is a completely different category. Someone can remain in your life while still emotionally holding themselves back from you. Someone can care deeply while struggling to fully access emotional vulnerability consistently. And for partners, this creates a strange kind of loneliness that's hard to explain to other people. From the outside, the relationship may even appear stable. But privately, there's an emotional wall you can always feel. Conversations rarely reach the deepest layers. Vulnerability arrives in brief moments and then disappears again. Emotional closeness feels temporary instead of secure. You start sensing that no matter how much time passes, a part of them is still standing near the exit emotionally. And what makes this especially painful is that avoidants often do not intentionally create this distance to manipulate people. Many are genuinely unaware of how emotionally unavailable they appear because emotional detachment has become normalized inside them. To them, shutting down feels calm, pulling away feels regulating, avoiding difficult emotional conversations feels practical. But to the person loving them, it feels like trying to build intimacy with somebody who keeps emotionally vanishing every time connection becomes real. This is also why avoidants so often return after creating distance. People misunderstand this cycle constantly. They assume the avoidant left because they stopped caring entirely, but that's not always true. What often happens is that closeness triggered emotional overwhelm, so the avoidant pulled away to regulate internally. And once the emotional pressure decreases, something unexpected happens. The feelings they suppressed begin resurfacing. Suddenly they miss the connection, they miss the comfort, they miss the person they emotionally distanced themselves from. Because contrary to popular belief, avoidants are not emotionless. In many cases, they actually feel emotions intensely but struggle to remain emotionally present while experiencing them, so distance becomes their coping mechanism. Space allows them to calm their nervous system enough to reconnect with feelings they couldn't access while emotionally overwhelmed, and this creates the painful push-pull dynamic so many people become trapped inside. The avoidant withdraws when intimacy intensifies, then reconnects once enough emotional distance restores their sense of safety. The relationship becomes a cycle of closeness and retreat, warmth and coldness, hope and confusion. And if the other partner does not recognize the pattern, they can spend years mistaking temporary returns for permanent emotional change. Every return feels like proof that love won. Every affectionate moment feels like a breakthrough. But unless the avoidant consciously works on the underlying fear of vulnerability, the cycle eventually repeats itself again because the real issue was never the relationship alone. The issue was the emotional survival system operating underneath it. What many avoidants rarely admit out loud, though, is that beneath the detachment there is often an enormous amount of hidden guilt. They know people get hurt by their inconsistency. They know their withdrawal creates confusion. They know somebody is left questioning their worth every time they emotionally disappear. But avoidance creates another painful paradox. The more guilt they feel, the more emotionally overwhelmed they become, and the more emotionally overwhelmed they become, the more likely they are to withdraw again. Instead of leaning into repair, they often escape the discomfort entirely.